well, that was a very robust account that the Chinese are just filling a vacuum where other people don't want to go, and you know that we are the last people who should be criticising this. So let's turn now to Shirong Chen, who grew up in China, and he taught English originally in China, and then he came to the UK at the beginning of the 1990s. And since, for the last 14 years, he's been at the BBC. He's now the China editor of the BBC and regularly broadcasts on Chinese affairs and travels to China. Of course, a lot of what is broadcast on the BBC is not available in China. It is blocked there, as this jamming equipment has actually also been used and imported to Zimbabwe, but that's another side. So anyway, Shirong, can you talk to us about the Chinese perspective?
Yeah. I'm glad that some of the BBC reports in English is still available in China, whether it's the website or radio and television, but that's another matter.
Yeah.
As a Chinese grown up inside China, we have different ideas or impression of the African continent. I was born in 1960, I don't mind saying that. But so when I went to, we grew up, we heard a lot about Africa as a kind of third world brothers. The Chinese government, or China as a country at that time, was itself very poor, but the government, the late Chairman Mao, still decided to give aid to African countries, and lots of them. And I learned to my horror, when Chinese people were starving, loads of money and material was sent to the African continent. I suppose that's how they bought the votes at the UN to get the mainland government back into the UN seat. Two different generations of Chinese, they have different ideas of Africa, the practices or even the natural resources. To the eunuch Zheng He, Africa is just a faraway land to be preached, to be told. Here is a central kingdom who has abundance of material and goodwill. But to my generation, it's more sort of the third world brother, as I said. But to a later generation, especially those who were born after the 80s and 90s, Africa is a place to make a killing for the Chinese. Because they say, well, it takes years to grow a tree, I suppose the free aid and the training and so on done in the 1960s and 70s have benefited the later generation in the sense of the friendship, the goodwill, and the contacts. What is Africa to the Chinese now may be different from 3 decades ago, but essentially China needed friends internationally. As a journalist, I've been observing how China is opening up the African market, the African continent, both diplomatically, business-wise, and everything else. Of course, China has left a different impression with different people, as Richard and Stephen rightly said. In fact, to me, it's different sides to the same coin. You cannot separate the one from the other. In fact, if China went out there just to be a benefactor, to a donor, I think it wouldn't work in the long run anyway. So this morning, as I came up from London here, I sat next to a Ghanaian business person, and I asked, what's your impression of China in Africa? He said, well, we like to do business with the Chinese. He then said, there's a fundamental difference between the Chinese approach and the Western approach. If a Westerner see a poor African person barefooted, the first thing they thought of would be give them aid. But to a Chinese person, that's a golden business opportunity. That's the way it is. But also, when people talk about, as Stephen said, there are different Chinas. When people talk about China, or the Chinese people, there are differences among different generations. For example, in the past few years, I have traveled to Africa a little bit, and on one occasion, I met a Mozambique government official, and he told me he liked China because China had been helping them. In fact, he was trained by Chinese military trainers in Tanzania to fight for their independence. On another occasion, another businessman from Northern Africa say, well, China is doing all right, and we have, as the others have mentioned, we have goods from China we wouldn't have been able to afford. China is selling from slippers to satellite to the African continent.